Our next storyteller, Michael Linsner, is a self-described, generally incorrigible itinerant bartender. He has a story about reflections on home and family and how we... I forgot.
I'll tell it.
Okay. Give it up for Michael Linsner.
Good evening. Can I do that? Is that okay? Sorry. A little bit nerve-wracking. This is my first storytelling event where I'm a participant, not sitting in the dark judging silently. So, yeah, please be kind. No, I wanted to tell a story about home. And I'm not from a far-flung locale, unless you consider Fresno, which is a culturally very different place to be far-flung. But still, I haven't lived in Fresno in many years, and I return to Fresno multiple times annually for reasons we all do. The holidays, right? The holidays are a little different in my family. They can bring up to 34 blood-related people together at once. It's either a warm menagerie or a shit show, depending on who you ask. But by way of anecdote, since the story shall be about my family and my grandmother, we'll start there. Probably 15 years ago, we are sitting at my parents' house in the dining room. A long table runs the length of the room, strung together out of whatever furniture we could string together at that point. And 33 blood-related people stand on either side of this table, laughing, arguing, cajoling. We finally get them quieted down. My grandmother stands at the head of the table with my father. My grandmother, a very small woman, but fiercely religious, begins crackling out grace in her waving voice. Dear Lord, please bless the food before us, and please bless us all for having come. And editorial error. Did I say that there were 33 people at the table? I meant 32. Because here comes my Uncle Mike. It is quiet as a fucking mausoleum in here. Probably threw a case of beer at that point, destroying the serenity of my grandmother's grace, as only family can. When I'm back in Fresno, it feels a lot like San Francisco, even though they're very culturally different. Being there is like walking through a dream. Granted, a dream with annoying amounts of driving attached to it, which is how everyone else in Fresno drives, but still a dream nonetheless. It forms my identity and is still a place of home for me. It's almost like, the ruts in a well-worn ancient road. I feel it's a palimpsest that I draw my identity from. My grandmother, however, was born in the bustling metropolis of Kalamazoo, Michigan in the 1920s. If you haven't heard about it, Google it. It may be on the internet now. My grandmother was one of 6 children and stayed very close to her siblings her whole life. Even after she had lived in California for decades, she still kept up with the local paper, talked to her local pastor, harassed, probably being the operative term, and did whatever genealogical or sociological research she could of the place. For her, home was crystallized in Kalamazoo. A couple years prior to her death, 4 or 5 probably, my grandmother was diagnosed with dementia. And while my family tried to engage it humorously, we developed what we called the 15-second loop. Anecdotes, jokes, stories, repeated at probably a 3 to 4 minute clip ad nauseum. While we embraced this humorously, my grandmother's condition was also deeply distressing. Sorry, I'm smiling because the joke comes next. It's probably the most interesting experience I have with the 15-second loop is we're moving my grandmother from Folsom, California to Fresno. We're going to put her in a home, right? And we need somebody to drive her. Well, I'm not going to make my father, who has had to listen to his mother his whole life, do this. So I take the train from San Francisco to Folsom, which is another nightmare that I could fill an hour with. But nonetheless, I am whisked from the train station by my aunt to my grandmother's house, where all of her belongings are packed into her car, once again, leaving one home for the other. Things start out well. Grandma and I are driving, she's telling old jokes and old stories, and then 4 or 5 minutes later, she'll tell them to me again, and I politely don't acknowledge that we've had this conversation before. We're hanging out. It's great. Then we hit traffic. Well, once again, traffic is something that moves. We hit a dead stop. However, my grandmother, the dynamo of energy she is, doesn't stop. My grandmother chatters and chatters and chatters. After about 45 minutes of no movement at all, I come to a breakdown. I am furious. I just can't take it. It's so stressful. And I'm about to yell at this 80-year-old demented woman, and that's just not right. So, at the nadir of my experience, I come to an epiphany. My grandmother repeats everything because she doesn't remember. meaning she won't remember this car ride. So I look over at my grandmother, big smile on my face, and I tell her that I will be smoking some very interesting and very smelly Turkish tobacco, and I fish a joint out of my jacket, and I continue to puff the whole thing down as we sit in traffic, because driving while stoned is bad, but sitting in traffic while stoned is fine. And then realize that the rest of the drive will be great, because she won't remember it, and I won't either. The thing was, though, a couple years later, my grandmother and I are once again back in Fresno, and I've picked her up from her retirement home. I'll be driving her to my parents' house where we have festivities. We're in the car, we're far out in the country in Fresno. That sounds like Fresno to you, but it is an urban area. And we pass the beautiful wooded expanse of Woodward Park on the right. And my grandmother looks at the park, and she proclaims how beautiful it is, and then she asks, Do you remember how beautiful your parents' wedding was there? It was magical. And those personalized napkins, I got such a great deal on. Grandma, I was born a decade after Mom and Dad got married. Okay. But the thing was that after that, my grandmother, still looking longingly out the window and reflecting, exclaims to me, I will never move back to Michigan again. And that hit me. Because I think that we use the word never in the sense of disapproval or rejection, right? I'll never do blank again. That sucked. Oh, we're not hanging out with Hal. Never again. He's an asshole, you know? It doesn't work in the terms of what we shan't be doing anymore. And I felt like for my grandmother at that point, we were reflecting upon this because the going forward was necessarily becoming more dim. And due to dementia, the going backwards had become more difficult. So sitting in my hometown with my grandmother, reflecting of all the places that she had lived and would now not go back to, I began to question what home was for me. I've lived in San Francisco, I've lived in Las Vegas, I've lived in the East Bay, I've lived in a couple different places and traveled somewhat, but to me, home was always anywhere that I had been and anywhere that I could go back to. Yet for her, it was crystallized in this one location. I decided then that home wouldn't be a solitary place for me, but would be a fractured remembrance of all the places that I had lived before. So when I, frail, in my 80s, crackling, my voice crackling, probably repeating myself ad nauseum, home wouldn't be a place that I longed for, but home would be a place that I had been present in all of my life.